Hey, this past Sunday, Pastor Wayne brought us a word about the discipline of calling. He shared with us that we are called to live in freedom, Galatians 5:13. He told us that we're called to live in peace. That's out of Colossians 3:15. Then he finished it up with that we are called to live holy out of 1 Thessalonians 4:7. We got a quick clip for you, kind of reviewing some of his points. He had 2 points. Remember, he said, I've only got 2 points. And he did a fantastic job. If you like this message, remember you can catch it full length either on our Facebook page here, or you can go to our YouTube channel and catch it there. We hope you guys are having a great week. Be blessed this week, and we'll see you on Sunday.
Everything we're going to touch on is going to be talking about called in the sense of everybody that's been born again. So if you're a Christian, if you're a believer, then absolutely every bit of this is going to connect with you. Okay? Got that up front? The called is purely going to speak about this. In this call, this calling, being called, God's called to us, every bit of this, in every passage we're going to look at, which is just going to be a few, but every verse we look at today, where you see that word, this just so blessed me the other night when I was looking, and I just kind of, I got kind of wondering this word, particularly when I was looking at calling that God has for us. And I looked it up in the original and all this, and this is really cool. Whether you're talking about God's calling us to Himself, whether you're talking about how God Himself does the calling, the calls, the ones that He does call for this, whether you're talking about us as living in this life as the called, every one of those terms comes back to this. It's talking about an invitation. And I thought, how awesome is that? That God so wants, somebody smile with me, God so wants these lives that He has created, that He comes to us and He invites us into His kingdom, into His family, into His work, into His plan, into His purpose. He invites us into it to come in and take a part of and be along for the ride with you. I've got 2 points today. My wife said, whoa, when I told her. She said, only 2. I said, only 2 points. So here's number 1. And both of these points are about who has what responsibility. Point number 1 is that it's God's responsibility to call. There's only one that does the calling, but He does do the calling. I think about one of the most well-known verses out of Romans chapter 11 where it speaks about God's gifts and His callings that He has for us. And again, this is not a vocational calling. This is a calling to come into His family, to be His son or His daughter. It says, for His gifts and His call can never be withdrawn from us. It's something that once it takes place, it's a done deal. Point number 2 goes like this. This is where you and I come in the picture. It's our responsibility what we do with it when we're called. And that's where the discipline's at. You remember what Pastor Seth's been sharing with us? I had to throw the D word in there. The discipline. I grew up, most of y'all know I grew up on a rice and soybean farm. And when you're raising rice, there's 2 things you keep with you all the time, for sure. You keep a pair of rubber knee boots, and you keep a shovel. Not one of them square gravel shovels, but a rounded dirt shovel. Because there's something you do when you raise rice, and you do it a bunch. You shovel a lot of dirt. It's just part of life in that. Well, this was here in Arkansas, and, early summer, late spring, what do we have? We have crazy thunderstorms and crazy downpours and stuff. And I remember this one particular time where we had a rice crop, and it was planted, and it was about this tall, and everything was done, and all was working good, And we get one of those crazy Arkansas afternoon thunderstorms, and it rained 6 inches that afternoon. Well, me and my dad and my brother were all like shaking our heads, and we're going, oh, this is not good. And we had fields scattered all over the place. And so the next morning, we go driving around looking, and all we could see was in these levees in the rice fields, there was holes washed in them and all this. And we realized real quick, we've got 2 weeks at least of shoveling ahead of us if we shovel every day from daylight to dark. Because you can't take a tractor out there, it's muddy, and you tear up your crop and all. You've got to do it by hand. And I'll never forget, my dad looked at me, he said, you need to go into town and see if Mr. Squirrel will come and help us. Now, Mr. Squirrel was this man that lived in a little town close to where we grew up out in the country. And this man, here's what he was known for. This is what he did for a living. This was pre-backhoe days. This man worked for the local funeral home, and he dug the graves by hand. Now, I grew up right beside a cemetery, and sometimes he'd be out there, and as a kid, I'm like, this is going to be cool to watch. And I'd watch, and in about 4 hours, this man could dig a regulation size and depth grave by himself, just with a shovel. Well, when you know a guy can do that, and you need to just shovel a bunch of dirt, who else is the better to get? And so I went into town and I found him. Now, this guy was about 5'6", maybe 120 pounds. At this point in time, he was in his 60s. He still was digging graves for a living. And so I asked him, I says, is there any way you can come and help us start tomorrow to shovel? And he said, sure, I can come out and help y'all. He'd helped us before. And he looked at me and says, would it be all right if I brought somebody with me? I said, man, you bring as many as you want to. We need some help because we got a lot of holes to fill up. And so the next morning, here's this little guy. He shows up, and he's got this dude with him. And it was a younger guy, but he was like about 6'2", and probably about 250. And he was built, and he had muscles. And he was wearing, one of them little wife beater T-shirts. And he comes out there, and he had his head shaved. And he just looked tough. And I'm thinking, whoa, this guy's going to move some dirt. And so we get out there, and we start right at daylight. As soon as it got light enough to see what she's doing, we started, and we're shoveling. Well, the young guy was kind of antagonistic towards the old guy, Mr. Squirrel. And he says to him, he says, oh, man, I'm going to shovel you under today. Mr. Squirrel's like, oh, okay. Now, this man sang while he shoveled. And so he's over there, and he had a rhythm. He'd stick it in the dirt, he'd pull it out, he'd put it down, and he'd pat it. He'd stick it in, pick up the dirt, put it down, he'd pat it. And he started singing this little song. He says, gonna shovel this old man in the ground. Then he'd go, gonna shovel this old man in the ground. And he's just singing the song. He's smiling, he's shoveling, He's not missing a beat. Well, I'm watching this bulk of a guy, this massive Hulk fella, and he's over there. And after about 2 hours, he's leaning on his shovel. And he looks like he's done. By the time we got to noon that day, the dude couldn't even pick his shovel up. And so him and Mr. Squirrel left to go get some lunch. And when they come back at like 1 o'clock to go ahead and shovel the rest of the day through that, the big dude didn't come back with him. I said, Mr. Squirrel, where's the guy? And he says, he tried to shovel this old man under there. I learned something that day. It's not about how strong you are. It's not about how big you are. But it is about how disciplined you are.